Hey everybody, here we go for the last video, and let me get a little more light here. Yeah, we're going to focus on tissues. Sorry about the cartoon. The focus of this video is to really start looking at some of the tissues specifically. We're going to focus on muscle and nervous here and give you just an introduction to epithelial tissue. What I want you to focus on here are the major characteristics of the tissues. These tissues have multiple types. What makes the tissues within a tissue type different? Where are they found? And then there's one missing from our list above: muscle, nervous, epithelial, and there's one missing. We'll focus on that one in class. Let's begin with muscle. And for two of these, we're just going to do a very brief overview because we'll focus on them more in the course later. Let's start off with the idea of what muscle is. The muscle that's in your arm, when you're flexing your arm, that's actually an organ. It's composed primarily of muscle tissue, but there's other things in there too, like blood, and you're going to have connective tissue and obviously a nervous innervation. But what does muscle do in general? It does produce movements, helps maintain our posture. The contraction of muscle helps generate heat. And the requirement for muscles to actually do anything is going to require ATP. We mentioned before ATP as an energy molecule. Here, I want you to think about this idea, though. When we're talking about muscle tissue, we're talking about tissue that's distinguished because it has contractile cells. These cells, contractile means that they can shorten. And when they shorten, they pull. When you look at muscle tissue under the microscope, you may see what appear to be little stripes or striations. You can sort of see them really well right here, what appears to be stripes that are running this direction. Okay, those striations are visible because of the internal cell organization. Specifically, there are proteins in there that give it that striped appearance. You can see that in this muscle tissue here. This actually is skeletal tissue or voluntary muscle. Over here is cardiac, and this is smooth on this side right here. And notice you see some striations here, some stripes in cardiac and some stripes in skeletal, but not in smooth. So there's one of those differences we talked about. How can you tell a difference between muscle tissue? The striations are one characteristic. Another characteristic that makes them different are whether they're voluntary, because only skeletal is voluntary, but involuntary muscle includes the smooth and the cardiac. Finally, the muscle tissue has limited regenerative capacity. Muscle doesn't go through mitosis the same way as other tissue types do, so there's a limited ability for muscle to regenerate. It can grow, it can get bigger. We know that from lifting weights, of course, but it doesn't regenerate as well as some other tissue types. Okay, so that's muscle. Let's go on now. Again, this is an overview because we'll be talking about muscle far more in a couple of weeks. But let's go on now to a discussion of nervous tissue briefly. Nervous tissue is distinguished because it is excitable. You can also excite muscles, but nervous tissue is thought of as excitable tissue. That is, it can carry impulses, because clearly nervous tissue is really about the electrical response of our body. So there's two major cell types to focus on here. One would be the neurons themselves. The neurons are the ones that actually conduct the nerve impulses, and those are the ones you see in the large features here. And then neuroglial cells, that term means glue, like nerve glue cells. Those are all the little dots you see all around it. They are important. They're quite important as support cells. But again, what distinguishes the nervous tissue is that you're going to see it's going to be comprised of cells, some of which transmit electrical impulses, the neurons, and they do this in the brain, spinal cord, and in nerves. Again, we'll focus more on the nervous tissue, on nerves and nervous tissue later on in the course. Finally, let me just give you an introduction to our last tissue type we'll focus on today, and that's epithelium. Epithelial tissue is going to be characterized by being either one of two things primarily. It's going to be a covering or a lining tissue. It's going to cover our surfaces inside and out. It's going to cover, of course, our skin. It's also going to cover inside our nose, inside our mouth, inside reproductive organs, inside our digestive system. So if it's exposed to the outside in some way, it's going to be lined with epithelium. And epithelial tissue is also glandular. When we think about glands like salivary glands, those are going to be glands that are going to be basically primarily epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is avascular. That is, it does not have a blood supply. And so you may be wondering, how could it possibly get its nutrients if it's avascular? Because, of course, blood is going to be carrying nutrients. If you look here at this is showing you, this top region is showing you epithelial tissue as the free surface of a, let's just pretend it's skin for a second. But what you see here are the capillaries. What we're going to get is diffusion, the movement of materials from a high to low concentration. That is going to be how epithelial tissue gets nourished. As you might guess, the tissue on the very top is going to receive less stuff than the stuff at the bottom, and that's exactly right. So the stuff on the top tends to be sloughed off, tends to be lost, tends to be dead, and gradually it's going to be replaced with the tissue that's growing underneath it. Because of this, because it isn't vascular, and because it's exposed to the outside environment so heavily, epithelial tissue is extremely mitotic. That is, has a very fast rate of reproduction, and it's regenerative. So I've heard, I don't know if this is true or not, but that you rebuild your stomach lining every 2 to 3 days. That would make sense given the acidic environment of the stomach and the constant exposure it's going to have to that, the epithelium to that acidic environment, that it would have to regenerate very, very quickly. You lose thousands and thousands of skin cells every minute. You are going to be losing cells every time food goes through your digestive system. So it makes sense that we have to have a very, very regenerative capacity for epithelium. This is also, though, why people tend to lose their hair or get very nauseous during therapy, like for cancer. If they're having chemotherapy or radiation, that radiation and chemotherapy targets fast-growing cells the most, like cancer cells. But since epithelium is also fast-growing and very regenerative, people tend to lose their hair because those cells tend to be affected by the same chemicals that would affect the cancer. Before we leave a slide, let me point out one more important idea here. There are really two surfaces we talk about with epithelium. The surface that's exposed to the environment, if you will, is the apical or the free surface. If you want to, in this case, it's on top. And the basement membrane is the bottom of the epithelial layer that connects to the underlying connective tissue. That'll be significant for you in just a second. Epithelium is a little different from the other tissues because we have to pay attention to a naming convention so that we know we're talking about the right kind of epithelium in different parts of the body. There are two considerations rather, we have for naming epithelial tissue: the number of layers involved and the shape of the cells, and this is important, on the apical surface. For example, the number of cell layers is indicated by one of two terms. Is it simple, indicating it's just one layer thick, or is it stratified? Is it multiple layers thick? So simple epithelium is just going to be one layer thick, and here's an example of this. You see this one layer of cells on this surface versus stratified. Here's the basement membrane. So, and here there's appears to be multiple layers of cells here. So this is stratified. So one convention is how many layers are there. The other convention is paying attention to the shape of the cells on the apical surface. And shapes come really in three varieties. Squamous means scale, means flat. So these cells, from any perspective, are going to look kind of like tiles, look scale-like. Cuboidal means the cells are roughly the same distance this way as they are that way. Their dimensions are kind of like a box, like a cube. If they're elongated, as you see here, they're longer on one side than the other, That's called columnar. Now, once again, it's important we're talking about the cells on the apical surface when we name tissue, because these cells up here look really kind of flat. These cells look closer to cuboidal. So we have to be careful that we're only looking at the cells on the outmost upper part of the cell, of the tissue layer rather, when we name it. Otherwise, you might get confused and name it something else. So here we have simple squamous, one layer thick of flat cells, simple cuboidal, one layer thick of cube-like cells, simple columnar, one layer thick of column-like cells, stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, and stratified columnar. These are all going to be multiple layered cells of epithelium. And then there's a couple of exceptions. One is transitional. That is, you will see this only in the bladder. As the bladder gets fuller and fuller and fuller, it stretches the cells on the apical surface. So you'll see a little bit difference there. It looks different when the bladder is empty versus full. And one other time it's a little strange is what's called pseudo-stratified columnar, because it appears there's multiple layers of cells, but there actually is only one. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. The final consideration you'll see sometimes is whether or not the epithelial layer is ciliated, whether or not it has any cilia. That's too many eyes, sorry. I can't get rid of it. Okay. C-I-L-I-A-T-E-D. Ciliated means it actually has hairs on its apical surface. So that's a consideration too. But to show you that, let's have a little practice over here. Here we got a chimpanzee, it appears. Let's see if we can name these layers, and we'll reveal them individually. Okay, when you look up here, what you see is what appears to be multiple layers of cells, right? Because you're kind of seeing a layer here and then a layer there. If you look at the nuclei, it appears you have a layer here and then you have a layer there. But notice all of these all touch the basement membrane. So that's actually going to be not stratified, but pseudo-stratified. And notice up here we have cilia on the apical or free surface. So can we name this? Well, there's cilia, there is pseudo-stratified, and the overall shape of this appears to be closer to columnar than anything else. So that is pseudo-stratified, ciliated columnar epithelium. That's a mouthful, but if you close your eyes and think about that terminology, pseudo-stratified, ciliated, columnar, those all refer to particular parts of that tissue, and you should be able to visualize it. Okay, here we have, we're not seeing the underlying tissue, but we only see one cell layer thick of sort of square-like cells. So that's going to be simple cuboidal epithelium. Down here, we have multiple layers of cells, right? And on the top surface, we have cells that are columnar, that are column-shaped. So that we're going to have stratified as part of our terminology, and we're going to have columnar because we see now we see both the shape and the number of layers represented. Up here, what do we have? Multiple layers of scale-like, flat-like cells. So stratified squamous. Okay, here, single layer of flat-like cells. Okay, simple squamous. And here we have a single layer of column-like cells, so simple columnar. One final thing before we wrap this one up. It's a nice time for us to remember this. There's a structure and functional relationship that applies to the tissue level as well. That is, the tissue matters its shape to its function. Here's an example. Simple epithelium is going to be involved with diffusion, secretion, and absorption. If you have just one layer thick, that's going to be a lot better to absorb or to have diffusion occur through it than if it was multiple layers, right? So simple is good for diffusion, secretion, and absorption. Stratified epithelium, though, is going to be far better for protection. If you have like your skin, you want to have multiple layers of cells to protect that. So we're going to see that for a protective role. Squamous cells, again, those cells that are tile-like, are really good for diffusion and filtration. And cuboidal or columnar cells usually have lots, because they're fatter, are going to have more prominent cell organelles, so they're going to be good for secreting and absorbing and protecting. So you may want to study this slide for a moment to really think about how does the shape of a tissue, we're down to this layers of cells and how they're organized, how does that really relate to their function, to their physiology? So it's just as important to focus on the tissue level of anatomy reflecting physiology as it is at the organ or system level. That's going to do it for this video. We will talk about epithelium more in class, as well as the last tissue type we didn't discuss, which is connective. Thank you very much. We're done.